a little about myself and what brought me to deal with this research. I grew up in Jerusalem with a Jewish Israeli family, and I live west of Jerusalem in the hills in a small community. For years, I was working in human rights organizations in Israel, documenting human rights violation committed to Palestinians in the occupied territories. And this work led me to be curious and wanted to learn more about the conflict, its history, the history of the Palestinians. For example, the refugee camps in the West Bank. What are these places? Where did these people come from? And I began to study a master's program focusing on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I learned things that maybe are obvious to you and to me now, but at the time came as like a big surprise. For example, that when I hear about Palestinians in Lebanon or Jordan or other countries, it's not just another ethnic group in those countries. It's people that came right from where I live, maybe even the same neighborhood in Jerusalem. And we use their lands and their houses, and we don't talk about them at all. And I learned to get to know better the places I had to leave behind. For example, Lifta, a village right on the entrance to Jerusalem, now a popular tourist destination for Israelis. And I was taken there a lot as a child, with a school, with the youth movement trips. And my perception of the place as a child was a place that, like, it's always been ruined and demolished and empty and silent and mysterious. And only years later I could figure out what was there not so long ago. Lively place with families, children, animals, agricultural activity, and today, nothing of that, and there's no sign in the place that tells you what was there. So this contradiction bothered me, and I wanted to learn more about the encounter between Israelis and the places, the remains of the Palestinian villages in the landscape of Israel. And this resulted in this book that originally was published in Hebrew and just now was translated and published here in English. And I focused on 4 aspects of this encounter between Israelis and the villages. One is whether Israel gave official names to the sites of the depopulated villages. Then if these places are mapped on official Israeli maps. Another topic is tourist sites that today contain remains of villages. What information is delivered to the visitors that go to these places about the villages. And last, Jewish communities that were established on the remains or in the houses of the empty villages. How do they relate to the village? So I will not go into historical background really, but just to set the frame. So before 48, Palestine was a predominantly Arab country with a small but growing Jewish minority. And during the war and right afterwards, around 750,000 Palestinians became refugees, mostly across the borders of the newly established Israel. And Israel confiscated all the property of the refugees, lands, houses, belongings, and decided not to allow the return of the refugees. I focused in my research on the villages. Of course, many refugees had to leave their houses in towns and cities. The Israeli policy regarding the villages was, for the most part, to demolish them, and most were demolished by 49. Some of them during the war for military or strategic reasons, or as a revenge action, and others were demolished out of a political decision not to allow the return of the refugees, and therefore to demolish their houses to prevent an incentive for them to return. But the remains of the villages stayed in the landscape well into the 50s and 60s, and there were several projects to what was called cleanse the landscape from the ruins that were perceived as something that uglified the landscape and raises questions that we don't want to deal with. So today, most of the villages are demolished, but remains of them remain in the landscape. For example, remains of structures, of walls, cacti bushes, orchard trees, and this became part of the landscape in Israel. The first issue I discuss is the issue of naming. In Israel, there is an official governmental names committee that is responsible to give official name to any feature on the ground, including ruins. I went to the State Archive to read documents of this committee to see what was its policy regarding the depopulated Palestinian villages. generally giving names is not just a technical thing. In conflicts and after occupation, often the occupying power erases the local names and gives its own names in its own language as a way to declare ownership over those places. And something similar happened also here in Israel. The general policy of the Names Committee was trying to revive ancient Jewish names, try to look in Bible and other ancient sources and to try to identify mountains, rivers, settlements with ancient places and to give the ancient names as the official Israeli names, and to erase foreign names, which were for the most part Arabic names. This was, of course, was a political act, and those who dealt with it were well aware of it, as we can learn from reading what they wrote. For example, the Names Committee wrote that the historical Hebrew names of the places in the land of Israel are the most faithful testimony that these places belong to our forefathers since time immemorial, and our rights and claims on these places and the land are ancient historical ones. And Ben-Gurion, the prime minister, said that we must remove the Arabic names due to political consideration. Just as we do not recognize the political ownership of Arabs over the land, we do not recognize their spiritual ownership and their names. Regarding the villages, the Palestinian depopulated villages, the committee was not sure what to do. They're supposed to give names to ruins too, but those places were demolished intentionally by Israel, so they were not sure if they should be named or not. Ben-Gurion in 51 decided that these places are gone and we should not give them names. When we will establish a new settlement there, we will give it a name. But not all the committee members were happy with this decision. Some thought that these places are still part of the history and geography of the country and should receive a name. In 52, Ben-Gurion agreed that we should give names to those ruins that it's necessary to include in the map, which he meant places that have more ancient histories that interest us, that we want to document. Eventually, what happened is that most of the villages did not receive official names. Even if they left traces on the ground, even if they were standing where they were for hundreds of years or more. Some received names for the ruins received an official names, and the site received an official name because of the name was given to a mountain or a well or an ancient site right in the place of the village. In the minority of cases where villages received names, the name was not the original Arabic name, but a Hebrew name or a Hebraized name that was the official name. In around a third of the cases, the committee managed to identify an ancient place and to declare that this is the official name of the place. Sometimes the Arab name retained the ancient name and slightly modifying it. In about half the cases, the committee could not identify a specific ancient place with the Arab village, but it still thought that there was an ancient place there, and it didn't want to erase completely the Arabic name because perhaps it still retains a Hebrew name, but we don't know which one. So they changed slightly the sounds of the Arabic name so they will sound more Hebrew and fix this new name, often meaningless in Hebrew, as the official name. In a few cases, they translated the Arabic name into Hebrew, and only 13 villages have their Arabic names as the official name in Israel. And in this case, the Arabic name also has a Hebrew meaning. The Names Committee realized it's not enough to fix new names. They have also to convince the public to use those new names. Because after the establishment of Israel, the Israelis, people who live in the country, did not know the new names. They used what they knew, which were the Arabic names. And the committee did all it could to prevent this practice. And they sent letters to school, to the media, to educational system, municipalities, urging them to stop using the Arabic name and use the new Hebrew ones. For example, they wrote to a children's magazine, "Your newspaper is commanded to fulfill also the following mission. In addition to the love of the homeland, plant in the hearts of the children the knowledge of the language of the homeland, Hebrew names instead of Arabic ones. You do not always insist on that, and the Arabic names appear on more than one occasion." They also wrote to the bus company that put on its bus station signs the Arabic names. Your insistence on Arabic names is neither commendable nor legal. You are failing the public and misleading it with names that have been completely and decisively abolished, and you are interfering with the instilling of the Hebrew names. Eventually, the work of the committee succeeded, and gradually the Arabic names were forgotten, and the Hebrew names are now in use for the most part. One of the goals behind the work of the Names Committee was to create a Hebrew map. When Israel was established, the official map that was in use was a British map. The British researcher collected the names that were used by the local population, the Palestinian population mostly, of villages, mountains, streams, and put them on the map. And 90% of the names on this map were Arabic names. When Israel was established, it uses the British maps as official maps of Israel, but those maps did not fit what Israel wanted to do. It was not a Hebrew map, and it also did not reflect the new reality after the war, because those maps are showing hundreds of villages that no longer exist. So what Israel did till the 60s, it uses those maps, but updated them according to the new situation. Near the Palestinian villages that were demolished, Israel put a sign that says demolished. And it also put it on a map, a stamp with the new settlements that were Jewish settlements that were established on the village lands. Only when the committee finished its work and gave names to any feature on the ground, only at that time in the 60s, Israel produced a new series of Hebrew maps. I wanted to check if when Israelis are looking at official maps, do they see the villages, the Palestinian villages marked on them, and in what way? So I chose a series of hiking maps, which are very popular among Israelis, at least at the time before they had Google Maps and stuff like that. And I located all the Palestinian villages and marked them on those maps. And I checked if those villages are mentioned originally in those maps. I found out that actually most villages are mentioned on the map in this way or another, but around 40% are not mentioned at all, and 64% don't have their names on the map. They have just a sign, which is a sign usually for a ruin, without identifying whose ruin, what's the identity of this ruin, and when it was ruined. Could have been a Roman ruin as well. And when in the minority of cases where the names appear on the map, it's usually the Hebrew name of the place, it's not the Arabic name. So this partly reflects the situation on the ground, because villages were demolished, so their names are not on the map, but it also reflects ideological decisions, because the Survey of Israel, which produces the maps, is supposed to map any feature on the ground, also ruins. And in many cases, Palestinian villages left traces on the ground that they are not mapped. And in this case, it's usually because they don't have more ancient history, because ancient sites from biblical time or Roman times are usually mapped even if they didn't leave traces on the ground. Using this map, I could locate how many villages are today within the boundaries of national parks, nature reserves, recreational parks and forests in Israel. And I found out that almost half of them are within the boundaries of such sites. For example, Jewish National Fund forests and parks, or nature reserves, or national parks, or private resorts, or places where a hiking path crosses the remains of the village. And in those places, there is physical encounter within Israelis and the remains of the villages. Those places are accessible to Israelis, which is not always the case with other villages. And this encounter is mediated by the authority that run those places, which is mostly the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, and the NPA, the National Parks Authority of Israel. I wanted to check when Israelis are coming to those places, what information they receive about the village, either a mention of the village at all, and in what way. So I visited all those places, and I looked at the signs and at the brochure that are distributed to the public, and also other publications written about the places and the websites of those organizations. I found out that in most of the cases, the villages are ignored. Either there are no signs or publications about the place where the villages used to stand, or there are signs and brochures that ignore the villages altogether. For example, Ramat Menashe Park, south of Haifa, the general description of the place talks about planted and natural forest, open space, gentle slopes, fields and orchards, streams and springs, sites of heritage and settlements, Jewish settlements, archaeological findings, and they don't mention 7 depopulated villages that used to stand where the park is now, which I marked in yellow, and they were not originally on the map. In the minority of cases, when the villages are mentioned in the text, it's done partially and in passing without providing details about the village, how long it used to exist, how many people used to live there, what they did for a living, what happened to them in 48. Sometimes there are folkloristic descriptions of the villages and what they did, what were their traditional customs and religious habits, and without referring to what happened in 48. For example, in Tel Lachish National Park, the texts talk about the demon tree, the only tree remaining on the hill, probably due to its sanctity to the residents of Kubeba, an Arab village that stood by the hill until 48. According to the legend, the villagers of Kubeba would send their children to bring water from the well, and to make sure they came back quickly, would tell them a demon lived in the plum tree guarding the water. Bringing water from the well thus became the test of courage for the village children. And the test does not say why the village stood there only until 48 and what happened to the villagers and those children after that year. Sometimes the text describes structure that remained from the villages without saying that those structure belonged to a certain village. For an example is the church of Kafir Birem, today within the boundaries of Bar'am National Park, that was declared to preserve an ancient synagogue that was found in the place. And the NPA text is advised leaving the synagogue and walking up a nearby hill topped with a Maronite church. Try identifying the animal on the lintel. Did you guess? It's the kangaroo, which carries its offspring in its pouch and protects them as the church protects its followers. We will then ascend the building in front of the church for a spectacular vista of the Meron Mountain Natural Reserve all around us. The text doesn't say who are those followers of the church. It doesn't say that there were actually Israeli citizens, Palestinians, that were displaced a few kilometers away and were not allowed to return to their village, even though the authorities promised them they will be allowed to return, and they keep struggling to return there, and even the Supreme Court agreed that they should have the right to do so. The text tends to focus on Jewish history, either ancient Jewish history or contemporary Zionist history, with often ignoring what was in between hundreds of years of Palestinian presence in the place. For example, the village of Sataf near Jerusalem, now a popular recreational spot for Israelis, where the JNF leases plots of lands to Israelis who come and plant vegetables. And the text of the JNF talks about the 2 springs that water agricultural terraces, a reminder of an almost vanished ancient Hebrew culture thousands of years old. Here, just like the ancient Israelites at the time, people tend irrigated vegetable gardens alongside orchards that require no irrigation. This is a hidden gem, as if it stopped the time from passing. Without talking about the Palestinian peasants that were the last ones to make their living out of those fields and orchards. In many JNF forests, there are commemoration stones that commemorate either Jewish communities lost in the Holocaust or donors that gave money to the JNF. And there isn't any commemoration to Palestinian villages, even if they stood right where the stones are. And those stones are often taken from the remains of the Palestinian houses that were demolished in the place. The texts tend to glorify the natural beauty of the places, often while ignoring the villages in them. Carmel Coast Forest, for example, is described as one of the most magical places in the country with many spots of grace and beauty, magical atmosphere like in a fairy tale, a forest that wraps the community of Kerem Maharal and Ofer, which are Jewish communities. And Kerem Maharal was built right in the houses of the Arab village of Ijzim. And the villages themselves, whose remains are under the trees now, are not mentioned in this text. Other texts refer to the villages themselves as part of this natural beauty. In the ruin of En Razal, in the photo, they are described as adorning the slope. And another village, Kudna, is identified as a picturesque ruin. Villages are sometimes just are mentioned as landmarks in a hiking trail, like streams and springs, without further elaborating on the village itself. We should walk left up the hill on a trail rising between the terraces and orchard trees to Agur ruin, which is the Hebraized name of the village, the big village of Ajur, which no information is providing about in the text. In many of the villages, lots of orchard trees remained, and sometimes they are being cultivated as part of the park and are mentioned in the description of the places, often without referring to the villagers and the villages that used to own them and to make their living out of them. JNF texts even talk about the orchard as a flora unit, which is extraordinary in its vitality and importance, the abandoned orchards that tend to grow beneath terraces. The texts often refer to the 48 war as part of what in Israel is called combat legacy, the desire to bring information about past wars to the newer generations. And in this context, the villages are mentioned either as targets for occupation or as hostile and violent against Jews, without talking about them also as civil communities. And when the villages are described as violent, they are also identified as Arab, which is not always the case. But in those texts, there is no mention why the villages were depopulated in 48, what happened to them, and what happened to the people afterwards. The village of Deir al-Hawa near Jerusalem, the text only says that in 48 the village was occupied by the Palmach El Brigade during Operation Mountain. A visit to the mountain at sunset is astonishingly beautiful. The village of Caesarea, the text only says that the village did not last for long, and does not mention that the village was actually depopulated after a bomb was exploded in a bus that left the village, that was put by a Stern Gang right-wing militia. The text doesn't mention also massacre cases and deportation cases. In En Zaitun, for example, according to historian Benny Morris, Palmach units expelled women, elderly, and children by shooting over the heads. Around 70 men from the village and other villages nearby were gunned down into a nearby creek, their hands tied, following instruction of a local battalion commander. Meanwhile, Palmach units blew up and burned houses in the village. And all this is not mentioned in the sign that was put near the remains of the village. It's only say in this context that the village was a base for Arab fighters and was occupied by the Palmach. The text almost never explain why the village turned into a ruin, why it was demolished by whom and in what way, even though, of course, when people visit the place, it's evident that the place was demolished. I'll now talk about Jewish communities established on the Palestinian villages. In the first years of Israel, around 700,000 Jewish immigrants came to the country, most of them refugees themselves, either Holocaust survivors from Europe or Jews from Arab countries that had to leave what they had behind and found refuge elsewhere. Around a third of them settled in empty Arab houses in cities and towns. The villages were, for the most part, were destined for demolition, but in 49 there was an initiative to try to settle Jewish immigrants in those houses. Levi Eshkol, the head of the Jewish agency at the time, promoted that, saying that we have many people that we need to provide housing for, and there are those empty houses. Why should we not use them for those immigrants? So dozens of communities were established right on in the Arab houses in villages. The living conditions in those places were very difficult because many houses were in bad shape, no doors and windows, no electricity, no running water, often far from towns and cities where people could find work, and sometimes near the border where Palestinians refugees were trying to come back to their houses and take their belongings, harvest the crops, and there were tense encounters between them and the new settlers. Many people who could abandon those places, and at some point the settlements movements in Israel decided that the Arab village, the way it is built, is not suitable for the modern agricultural community that they were trying to create. So most of those communities were moved 1 or 2 miles away, were built from scratch, and the Arab village was demolished. But still, around 40 Jewish rural communities today are on what used to be the built-up area of Palestinian villages. Some of them even still live in the Arab house. I wanted to check the people who came to live in those places, what they felt and how they related to the Arab village and to the fact that they use property of others that are denied from. I read publications of 25 such communities, mostly kibbutzim and moshavim, Jewish agricultural cooperative communities. I went to their archives and they read mostly internal newsletters of the community, an anniversary publication, and their websites to see how they refer to the village. I saw that in most cases, the publication mentioned the fact that their community was established on a depopulated Arab village. For example, Kibbutz Sasa, established by American Jews in the village of Sasa, the idea of the kibbutz says, name Kibbutz Sasa, birthplace, the abandoned village of Sasa. And Moshav Kerem Ben Zimra in the Galilee, in its general review, says that the Moshav was built on the ruins of the Arab village of Ras El Ahmar. And so on. All the publications give this basic fact about their community. But other than that, they usually don't talk about the village, about its history, about its people, what they did for a living, what happened to them in 1948. When the villages are mentioned by the text of the communities, it is usually in the context of the use that they made with the remains of the village, mostly the houses. Kibbutz Yiron, for example, wrote that the Arab stones homes are serving us faithfully. We have refurbished 17 residential rooms and some 10 service structures in the buildings of the village of Saliha, which we refurbished for their temporary usage and named their own. Kibbutz Bet Guvrin shows in its newsletter a remnant of the Arab village of Bet Jubrin, which is not mentioned in the text, that serves as a laundry room. In some communities, there was a specific Arab house that had a special role in the history of the community, of the Jewish community. It was usually a especially big house, sometimes the only house that remained from the village, and the community in the early years made a lot of use in it and writes about it in a nostalgic way. Kibbutz Abonim, built on Kafir Lam, talks about the Mukhtar's house, that used them as a general kitchen, the volunteers' kitchen, carpentry workshop, club, storeroom, sewing workshop, and the houses remained the nerve center of the Moshav. Kibbutz Megiddo even wrote a poem for the Arab house of the kibbutz. When we came here in February 1949, we looked at you, house, to find a spark of hope and a glimmer of light. You, the one and only, whom we called the Arab house. For without you, we would be lost, and as the homeless. When the new settler came to the place, they often found the orchards of the villagers, and they tried to cultivate them and make profit out of them, and they wrote a lot about it and referred to the orchard as their own. Kibbutz Ariel, for example, talks about the Beijiz grove. It looks lovely. The olive bloom is gradually turning into fruit. It seems a large crop is forthcoming. Our groves are the most beautiful in the area. We accept serious income from this grove. In Kibbutz Bet HaEmek, in the photo, many ancient olive trees from the village of Koikat, on which the kibbutz was built, remained inside the kibbutz on the kibbutz lawns. And the kibbutz developed a special tradition where the youth of the kibbutz collect the olives every year, sells them, and with this money they help funding their road trips to Poland, visiting concentration camps and learning about the Holocaust. And the kibbutz decided the olives are the property of the kibbutz and trusted to the youth to sponsor the Poland project. As a references in text of those communities to the villages is their aspiration to turn the village from Arab to Jewish, from backward to modern, from a desolate, empty, ruined place to a blooming place, and to change the Arab landscape, which is conceived as something negative. Most of the publication I read did not express feeling this way or another regarding living in the houses that belong to others. But some writings of kibbutzim did express feeling of discomfort, of pain, of dilemma. Kibbutz Yiron, for example, when we reached the place where Yiron was to be established, the Arab village, Saliha, induced a gloomy mood in me. It was a place that one could see has been abandoned not so long ago, and many houses displayed signs of looting. Kibbutz Kabri, when you see what happened to the Arab village of Kabri, which stood where it did for hundreds of years and was home to people and children, and here it stands devastated and desolate and all its residents scattered all over, your heart aches and you feel how negatively tragic this is. And the members of Kibbutz Kabri, by the way, were also displaced in '48 from their original kibbutz near the Dead Sea, which became Jordanian territory, and they moved and they established Kibbutz Kabri on the village of El Kabri. The only communities that dealt a lot with what they saw as a dilemma, moral dilemma between their ideology and the reality of living in a depopulated village was Kibbutz Sasa, which was established in the houses of the village of Sasa near the border of Lebanon. They wrote, for example, here we were American Jewish pioneers, come to help build a new homeland and create a new society. We were bred on American fair play, and HaShomer HaTzair, left-wing youth movement, bi-nationalism, living in harmony with our brothers. It was bad enough living in the village where you could almost feel their presence, where part of their possessions were left behind, with a storm filled with last season's crop. If all this was not enough to burst our ideological bubble, there was a problem of what to do with the mosque. When they settled the place, the mosque of the village was still there. And the Israeli army, put pressure on the kibbutz to get rid of the mosque. And the kibbutz people were divided. Some thought that this is immoral, we cannot do that, it's not ours, and perhaps we can even collect money and deliver it to a refugee fund in Lebanon because they use their property. And as I say, when we're here anyway, we use our houses, we're not going anywhere, why should the mosque keep standing here? Eventually the army didn't wait for the decision of the kibbutz and blew up the mosque without even informing the kibbutz, and even one of the kibbutz members was wounded from the explosion. The kibbutz devoted part of the Passover Haggadah, the traditional book for Passover, to the Palestinian village and to their dilemma in living in it. This part is traditionally devoted to the suffering of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt and is symbolized by the bitter herb. In the Sasa version of the Haggadah, it goes like this. Our herb is a very bitter one, and even if we should succeed in removing all other physical traces of it, its taste will linger. Once there was an Arab village here. The fields we tend today were tended by others 1 year ago, and when we came, the desolation of their lives cried to us through the ruins they left behind. What gives us the right to reap the fruits of trees we have not planted, to take shelter in houses we have not built, to till the soil preserved by the sweat of foreign hands? On what moral ground shall we stand when we take ourselves to court? But eventually the members of Sasa stayed in their kibbutz, as were the other communities, and different communities gave different justifications for why they stay and why it's okay to live in our village. Some says that it's their fault, they chose to flee. There were Arab homes here, Arab huts. It did not bother me. They fled and it was their fault. They had listened to the mufti, to their leader, and I do not pity them. Kibbutz Sasa said it's a matter of self-defense. We are not responsible for this cruel and forced contradiction, but we've been forced into a position where we must fight for our lives and the lives of our people. And today life is largely determined by frontiers, and frontiers must be defended no matter what the price. And Kibbutz Kabri showed it as an inevitable result of war. The village was abandoned after a murderous assault by the locals on a convoy trying to break through the siege on Kibbutz Yechiam. Maybe some of the villagers did not support the action and did not take an active part in it, but when the fire begins to burn, it burns everything, damp and dry. Generally, the ambivalence and the ideological dilemma of Sasa was an exception in the discourse of the communities built on villages, which tend to accept the situation and justify it. But we have to keep in mind that those people were themselves, for the most part, refugees, and they dealt a lot in life and in the writings about mourning of the world that was lost behind and trying to adjust to the new situation and surviving in new communities they tried to establish and all the difficulties. And they didn't leave much room for them to look at others. And it's maybe not coincidence that the communities that really dealt a lot with those dilemmas is Kibbutz Sasa, whose residents were not refugees, but people who choose to come from the United States to Israel. And in all the cases, all the references to the villages were by first-generation settlers who experienced the more concrete encounter with the village, with the belongings, with the houses, sometimes with the Palestinian refugees trying to come back. And I could not find references to the village from a newer generation. For them, they know their community was established on a village, but it's something, it's like a historical fact, and it has nothing to do with our daily lives. So to conclude, in all the aspects of the research I checked, I found marginalization and erasure of the Palestinian villages from the Israeli awareness. And the result is that Israelis have a picture of their country as a predominantly Jewish country with very little Arab history and geography. And this is not, it doesn't happen by itself. It happens through mechanisms like the JNF and others that shape the collective memories of Israelis. And this has, of course, contemporary political implications, because what happened to the Palestinians in 1948, the tragedy they experienced, the loss, the price they paid for the establishment of Israel, all this does not have weight in with the way Israelis see the conflict and the way it should be solved. And I don't portray desired solutions here, but I just think that whatever solution should be, the first step is trying to look with open eyes at what happened in 1948 and since 1948, and to take responsibility for our part in it, and to acknowledge the loss of the other side, and trying to find ways to redress it. And only with that we can try to find reconciliation. Thank you, and I'll be happy to hear comments. She asked about the work of Zochrot and how my work fits with their work. So Zochrot is an Israeli organization that is devoted to bring the information on the Nakba, on the Palestinian side of the history of 1948, the loss of the Palestinian communities, to bring this information to Israelis and try to work for their right of return. I work a lot with Zochrot. We did several things together. The guidebook that was mentioned that I co-edited was published by Zochrot. It's a guidebook that takes Israelis to visit depopulated villages and towns, Palestinians. I worked with them on producing a map, a Hebrew map that shows all the depopulated communities and other things. And I do tour guides of groups. Some of them also come through Zochrot.
Thank you so much, Noga.